Hello and welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the Brain and Mind Centre. And I'm very pleased to be chatting to two amazing women today, Tracy Schrans and Melissa Salmon from Focal Research Consultants. Tracy is the president, the person who's been running this show for many years now, and such an expert who I've had the privilege of knowing for most of my career. And Melissa, I've also known you for many years from when you were a PhD candidate. It's fantastic to see your fantastic career and coming around to Focal now as the, running the applied behavioral science aspect of the team. So I did promise I wasn't going to give you long bios, despite both of your fantastic, especially Tracy, your long career, more impressive career and accomplishment. So what I thought I would do it's my habit of this season of having you describe, I might start with you first, Tracy, of when you meet people at many of the conferences that you're constantly at, how do you describe what you do?
Yeah, it's funny because I was listening to a couple of your other panels that you had that were just wonderful, and I loved the answers I was hearing from some of whom were colleagues that I've known for a long time, and I loved hearing what their answers were. I think for me, when they ask us what we do, I think fundamentally at the very basis of everything we do is I think of myself as a researcher. Yeah, we might be developing software, we might be doing tech, we might be doing things now that we weren't doing before, but I always think of us quintessentially as being researchers. And in particular, I think we came from a slightly different background in studying gambling behavior rather than studying problem gambling behavior. So we initially started doing that from that perspective back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and from that basis, because we were working for our government and for our public health, we had a lot of the same, or we had basically all the stakeholders were at the table. And so when somebody asked me what we do, and I was at my dentist, and I said, well, you're not going to believe this. What we do is we are looking for risky gambling play patterns so that we can find ways to make this a little bit safer for not only the gambler, but for communities and their families. And so I think that's how I sum it up when somebody asks me what we do. Maybe throw in analytics there a little bit.
Yeah, and that's so great. I'm definitely going to get into this because you have been doing what is incredibly popular and sort of, not to say trendy now, but everyone's talking about now, that's for sure. So I'm very keen to hear from you, your perspective of the take on what's currently happening. But first I want to turn over to you, Melissa, and you have been in the field for a while now as well, coming from Carleton University and moving around a little bit. How do you sort of think about your own career in this space?
I would say quite similar to Tracy is that, at the end of the day, I do consider myself a researcher. That's, my passion, what I've been trained in. But I feel like what I have researched has changed quite a bit over the years. And so I think my journey really started in more of like intervention focused research. So how do we help people who are experiencing gambling problems change their behavior? We know so many people don't seek treatment. So really, what are those ways that we can get them to maybe, direct or engage in more self-directed change? And then throughout my career, I've kind of become a lot more interested in prevention as well. And so I think that kind of complements both sides of things because it's a lot easier to help people to stay safe than it is to try and change behaviors that are quite ingrained and quite, very difficult to change really at the end of the day. And so I know I'm only a year at Focal. I'm quite new to the whole AI data analytics side of things, but I'm just fascinated by what we do. And it's just the applied nature of the work and just really seeing the impacts of it has just been incredible. So it's, yeah, been quite a journey, learning a lot. And it's been good.
And it's so great to have you both. So, today we're going to be talking about risk and markers of risk, and very much what you're saying, Melissa, on prevention, early identification, which is something that I've always been really passionate about. Is, we don't want to wait till they walk in my doors as a treatment, many years after the problems have become very severe. We want to look at how can we identify early, intervene, keep people if they want to be gambling, and it's better for a sustainable industry. It's better for, the community. It's certainly better for the individuals and their families. But it's really been, and I probably don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but it's been a real journey of how this can happen despite the industry's best efforts in some cases, best claims in, potentially a more cynical view. And, Tracy, you and I've seen you present, and as you say, many years working in this area. I'm really keen to have you provide a bit of a background, and not necessarily to go into the history, but to share with people from your perspective how you've seen the use of identification of risk markers change over time, from what we could do to what now is actually possible with the technology that's in place.
Yeah, I think that there has been, and as you said, there's been it's almost, probably the computing power is what's revolutionized the use of data analytics, and in particular now the advent of what they're calling AI, and we know how fast that is going to be changing even now. When we think about it, was only introduced to us, I think the first time that I'm seeing, anything on ChatGPT or anything was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago at a conference. And now we're using this ourselves. There's going to be a lot of other changes coming too, but that's the one thing we can be certain of. And I think people fail. They often say, okay, you're the folks that looked at land-based and use land-based data. And for us, I said, yes, it is, because there was only land-based when we started doing this modeling. There was no online, product at all at that point in time. Since that time period, we not only have seen it go, into from land-based to online to, digital, but we're seeing now new forms coming very quickly again. And what we soon realized, and we realized this when we were working even with the land-based, is that it really doesn't matter. It's the data sets that you have to work with. And so you're going to always have to change. We've really been worried because there's been so much emphasis placed on identifying harm, indicators of harm. One thing we do know from starting out, doing the very first models we built in 1998 using the data, is that data that we had then has changed dramatically. So what we were using as indicators in 1998 are very different than what we were using as indicators in 2005, that again were different in what we were using for, even more quickly in 2016, and then 2017, and then 2019, and it's been escalating all the time. And what we realized was this: we were looking for these magic indicators or these magic algorithms that could be used, and the truth of the matter was that we just couldn't find them. You used the very best information you had. For example, people will recall excellent work done by, Ian McHale and David Forrest, and they had looked at how they could see people who are gambling after midnight were, more likely to be having problems. They were thinking this is an effective way to target your resources. But then what happens is the hours of operation change. Now, this is no longer an effective way to be able to find it. This is no longer an effective indicator in any kind of market where that's going to be used. So we use those as some, just an example. So what we started to do is move away from the idea of us finding, these what are called, key critical risk indicators. And we started to say, maybe what we need to have is key outcome indicators so that we can see whether or not what we're doing is having desired impact. The models themselves and the variables themselves may change as the data changes, as the products change, as the regulations change. However, the impacts and outcomes are what we started to realize tended to have more universality. And so we would love to see as much effort put in that part of it so that we can be assessing whatever might be coming down the pike and be able to see if it's actually having the intended impacts that we were looking for, or whether they need to be adjusted or changed. So it becomes a framework for monitoring and constantly updating that information to keep it relevant and useful.
So just unpack that a little bit for me. And I totally agree. If you have risk markers, the population changes. So the people who are gambling in 2024 are not the same people who are gambling in 2004. So, and
Right.
you know, someone that's gambling in one venue is going to be different to someone who's gambling in another venue, even within
Absolutely.
the same jurisdiction. So it's very difficult to come up with really solid predictors that are going to reliably work from that. And then, of course, if you have this like layering of policy change, intervention change, you know, you change one variable, you start, for example, interrupting people every 3 hours, well, all of a sudden everyone stops gambling at 2 hours and 45 minutes. So is it then, are you saying it's not the right goal to be trying to identify risk markers? Is this something that is a kind of a waste of effort, or you know, what's your takeaway on that then?
You know, I don't want to say it's a wasted effort, because anything that you're doing to understand that data and to work with it is important. But one of the things I would say is, if I could give advice to anyone else who is doing that out there, is the whole reason for using a model is for efficiency. Okay, it's to be more efficient in finding your target. Now, the important thing about a model is it can never rule someone out. All right, it can rule someone in, but it can't rule them out, because you will only ever be able to detect a minority of people using a model that are in your target. However, with a good model, if you can interact with 1 to 2% of your customers to find 30% of the people who are in your target, now that's efficient. That means suddenly you can start to deliver that message in a meaningful message to the right person. And if we can start to do this more quickly, even if it's a product interface as well as a person interface, then we're even doing it in real time and at the right time. So you're able to now target your resources more effectively, which is what a model is supposed to do for you. But what happens is that we've had to use the data that was available out there, which was prevalent studies. That's what we had to use initially. You're trying to get this from survey work, you're working on general population. And then what we were looking at is we were looking at understanding about, we would compare people who are having problems to those who were not having problems in order to see what the differences were. And we knew that there was two things from all the work we've done and the work you've done, Sally, and even whether it's online or wherever, that the two best ways for us to find people who are having a problem, if you want to talk about the best way, if you have to use two variables, then they're going to be a risk indicator for you. It would be the type of product that they're using and their general frequency in using that. So if you are using a higher risk product that has a higher spend cycle, okay, and you are doing that on a regular basis, like maybe every time you get a paycheck, whatever it might be, your regularity, then right away, we know by looking at those two things that we will make it more efficient to find people who are having difficulties. However, among those people, that's where things become really different. Frequency no longer has any bearing on it. And now we're all looking at, and within a particular product, as you noted, things are going to change. Products change all the time. New game comes out. We didn't even have I guess, in-session betting that was allowed in sports betting until the last couple of years. So we couldn't even have those in our initial models because that wasn't allowed. So, but it's become an excellent predictor since. And there's going to be another one that comes along after that as well. So what we have to do is get very creative with those variables that we're looking at. it is about the data. You will have heard that from Earl Hall and from all of these people that come out and talk. But what they lead you to believe is that AI is going to look for these patterns and find them. They're going to look for what we give them to use to look. That's all it can use, okay? But as we start to create more and more ways of looking at this data, and we use things like ensemble models, so maybe we have multi-layers because there's a different play pattern for someone who is an escape gambler than someone who is, you know, a high intensity gambler. You know, they're completely different play patterns, and yet, you know, we need to be able to find those people at risk in the highest tiers and in the lowest tiers. And you can have that complexity. You don't have to keep it simple with a model. But just because you're having all that complexity there doesn't mean that it has to be difficult for people to understand why they've been identified. And so, and I'm going to actually kind of pass this over to Melissa, because this is just some recent work that we've been doing, because we knew we could identify people well. But you know what the big complaint was? Is you need to be able to tell them why. Why are you going over there to talk to them? And you know, Sally, you and I have had this conversation before about people actually saying it's more important to have transparency than accuracy. It's more important that we've heard regulators say this as well. And to us, that's really, it's shocking because the cost of inaccuracy might be very, very high. And so how can we then make this understandable? But keeping in mind that maybe the model itself is like the thermometer. It's telling us to look here, but it's not going to tell you exactly why. You know, it's today they were losing, they did this, they did 4 other things, and those are red flag behaviors that we typically see among high-risk people. Tomorrow, they're winning, and they didn't lose. There's a different way to be able to have to identify them. Actually, Melissa, maybe you want to speak a little bit to some of how you can use the player insights. And those are some of the things I think that, Sally, you were talking about as universal indicators, things we do recognize as having universality, you know.
Definitely. And so with these play insights, basically what we've done is we haven't sacrificed the, you know, complexity or the accuracy of our models. They still kind of operate the same way. But for staff who are going out and interacting with these players, it's important for them to also feel confident about why they're interacting with this person and why this person might be at risk. And so we've taken these, I guess, harm indicators, for lack of a better word, or just, you know, things that really are in control of the player, and things that do tend to be targeted during these interactions, and presented staff with kind of extreme behaviors in each of these areas. So, for example, players who, you know, experienced bigger losses than, let's say, like 80% of all other players kind of in that month. And taking these very cumulative, risky, extreme behaviors and presenting them to, kind of at the back end, I guess, for staff, so that they know why players, you know, might be at risk, and they have some more talking points to speak with them about. So it's not so much about just, you know, they're at risk and go speak with them. We also try and provide, you know, like messaging around that, conversation tips, understanding why this behavior might be risky. And then it just gives a bit more, I guess, like explainability to all of this, because we do know that they're at risk. We know that they can benefit from an interaction, but really that missing piece is why. And so this is kind of one of our approaches that we're testing out and evaluating and implementing. And we're, you know, very excited. I think it's going to lead to some great outcomes for staff and for players. But it is one way that we're kind of getting around that balance between complexity and transparency.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because at the end of the day, the identification of risk isn't actually what creates any change at all. It's what you do with that. You know, who is notified? Is it a notification to the player? Is it a notification to staff members? Is it a notification to the product, which automatically shuts off? You know, what happens? And that then begs the question of how, you know, or what tier you're identifying. So in the venues at the moment, many jurisdictions which have these sorts of regulations have something along the lines of, if you've identified a player as having, gambling problems, then, here are these steps to follow, which are basically like, if they're, 100% definitely have agreed that they have problems, then, self-exclude. But other than that, okay, play as usual, that, there's, no requirement for the venue to do anything. So that's, as we've talked about, that's not really very effective for prevention. It's, really waiting for the house to be on fire before you start, doing anything about it.
Yeah.
So, you're talking about a much broader range of customers to identify in different risk levels. How do you think about how strong the risk indicator has to be? What are the different tiers? How do you set the kind of the criteria for, intervene, minimal intervention, moderate intervention? How do you set those benchmarks? Because I think that's where it's really, really tricky, because it's a really bit of a sliding scale and a grey area in terms of there's no really clear, okay, you're low risk, now you're moderate risk. There's not a switch in time. And behaviors, as you've said, behaviors change over time. Someone can be gambling problematically on one day. It's a behavior. It's not, it's not a diagnosis. It's a problematic behavior in the moment. So is it session by session? Is it day by day? Is it accumulation over time? How do you think about those sorts of temporal and severity factors?
There's really, I'd say there's kind of, to unpack that and put it into two buckets here. One bucket is going to be, I think, hitting that harm reduction part of which is a very different thing than prevention, which is another bucket. And we're going to say, it was kind of like what we always said about the PGSI. The PGSI was really meant, for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what the PGSI is, the Problem Gambling Severity Index, was really meant that the higher the score that you scored on there, the greater the certainty you were having problem. Not, an indication of risk, but the certainty that somebody fell in there. Somehow we got that mixed up, okay, as a construct. And it really, and yeah, there might have been a couple of different loadings, and we try to say now goes down to 5. But the reality is, as people score higher on that PGSI, they definitely are more likely to be having problems. Now, one thing a model cannot do, although it may identify people who are problem gamblers, and frequently does, is that it is now looking for behaviors that are associated with having problems that we see predominantly among those with problems, and we don't see among those who don't. So that model is actually looking at identifying people for harm reduction purposes, because you're either early having harms or you're later having harms. But as you pointed out, Sally, the harm's already happening. We are not getting it before it's there. There are some occasions where you may, when somebody has just moved into adopting some behaviors, it's early and it's a lot easier to interact or intervene with somebody at that point, the first time they score in there. But the model itself is going to be completely different, and it's going to identify those who are most likely, okay, to be in your target of those who are harmed or likely to be harmed in the future because how they're playing. There needs to be there's a different model. And here's one thing where we see this happen all the time with models, is they think that when they are put into the red zone, somebody's, been identified by the model, that everybody else is okay, right? If then you might be at some orange and then the rest are down in the green, and go ahead and do what you're going to do. Remember what I said to you before, is that no model can find the majority. The only way you could find all of them is if you interact with all of them. But if you have got a model where you're introducing with, let's say you're interacting with the top 5% of people in this category, and you can reach 40% of people having problems, that still means 60% of people who are having problems are in those other categories. So guess what you have to do? You need another model now that is actually, now that you've seen there's the absence of play behaviors you can assign into this risk, you're now looking for the presence of low risk playing patterns so that you can put them into the green zone, because you automatically know that you've got the majority of those people. You still will never be able to to detect in there. You've got other methods you're going to use as an operator for that. But so it's not simply the, you don't score on this, you're okay. It is ruling. That's what we were talking about before. It's about ruling people in. You can't rule people out. So you need a separate model for that. And you need to look for different types of behaviors in that case. Now, what is so rewarding about that, though, is it lets you do something else. It lets you see and monitor behavior after you've had that interaction you were talking about, after you've delivered a message, and you see which messages are most effective in what circumstances. And you actually can see whether or not it produces, not just takes them out the red zone, but actually, leads to the development of lower risk play patterns, which are detectable, and they don't know what they are. Okay, there may be, for example, in one of our algorithms, we might have 300 different cue sets, and there might be 8 different algorithms in it, and because remember we said you can be complicated with this. This is the part that can be complicated. What can't be complicated is that message then you're delivering. And so and then you get to be able to see what kind of an impact are we having. What worries us is this, though, is that if you take, for example, a rule-based, like I think you had mentioned a little earlier, let's say interacting after 5 hours or 3 hours, or pick a time, it doesn't matter. What you want to say, and the regulator has made this a rule because they think they've been told from those prevalence studies that the majority of people having problems, in fact, 100, let's say 100% from Paul Del Fabro's work, it did show that, and we get the same results, okay, as he got in our prevalence studies, that 100% of people with problems will have played at least for, once for 3 hours or more. And on average, they'll be playing that long. And then what they've done is they compared that to, they looked at how many of the no risk people are, and only 50% of them, 100 versus 50. It's twice as high among the people having problems than it is. And they say, okay, this would be a good way to find them. Except for in the real world, if you've only got, let's say 10% of all regular customers are having problems, they're going to make up, that 10%. But the other 90, okay, let's take them, the 45 that are playing for that 3 hours too. So you put that 45 with the 10, and what's happening is you will be wrong more times than you will be right in interacting with that. You're wasting all these resources on people that don't need to see or talk to someone right now, and it's not relevant for them. And then what happens is the people that you might have, by even just using visual cues that you used to use before, you're not, because you haven't got time anymore. You have to hit this compliance. And is it actually doing, I mean, the regulator's not trying to put something in there that's going to be ineffective. The operator sure doesn't want to be doing something that's ineffective. So what we have to have is that evaluation component in there so that we can demonstrate whether or not this is even, because everybody's got an idea about how it works. We don't have to, we can check it now. We can actually test this and see whether or not it's doing what you're hoping it'll do.
Yeah, and there's so much there. I mean, one of the things I really want to pick up on is one of the first things you said, that idea of, it's not the 1%. And we hear this time and time again. It's one of my big pet peeves now that, it's only 1%, 1% of players. I'm like, yes, that's prevalent studies, not your population of players. And this idea again, that just because someone doesn't, isn't being observed to have the risk markers that some regulator has written down on a piece of paper somewhere, or it's based on science, best practice, or it's not the 3 hours that these rule, like, if it's not on this list of strong indicators, we kind of think I can appreciate from a venue point of view, it's really tricky. You're saying, well, I'm abiding by regulation, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And there are some people from a clinical point of view, there are people who have very, very severe gambling problems who do not look. You cannot see it. You cannot see it in their behavior. It's arguably from a venue point of view, they're saying we could never have identified that. And I would actually, as a clinician, say, right, unless you had really sat down and gotten them to open up, which is again not the venue's necessarily responsibility to kind of get these people into a psychoanalysis, and so it's really difficult. So But I like your idea then of saying what we need to do is identify the non-problematic players so we can kind of keep an eye and encourage that behavior. And I think that's a whole nother conversation of how do we identify
Absolutely.
and encourage low risk gambling behavior so we can have some much more concrete guidelines for what our outputs are. But one thing I want to maybe, and I don't know if Melissa, you have the data on this, is touch on just to give people an idea, to provide some clarity on this, because I've read all your research reports, but not everybody has. You know, what proportion of people in a venue with, you know, exhibiting gambling problems do you think that, you know, the best algorithms and it, you know, focal or even like with best practice, what's the kind of best practice benchmarks we think could be identified? I just really want to get people an understanding of when we have these, how magic can these AI risk identification algorithms be?
So yeah, that might actually, Tracy, I don't know if you want to speak to that. I think
you know what, they can be pretty magical. Okay, this is the thing. But there's a cautionary note with that. It depends on what you might be identifying. Okay, so it matters what you use to build your model. This idea that, you know, you can just let it run and use unsupervised learning to find, you know, a pattern of play. That pattern of play that looks like your best customer can also be somebody who is having a great deal of difficulty. Somebody who looks like, you'll hear, oh, always look for change. Okay. And I think, Sally, we were at one time a presentation saying, yeah, you want to look for change variables to be for your models. Because somebody suddenly has increased what they're spending, or alternatively, decreased what they're spending. Decreasing their spending was seen as a good thing until we even thought it was a good thing until we did the affordability index. And what did we find out? We found out that for a small portion of people, that they've tapped out of their resources.
Yeah.
A decline in their expenditure is a result of them having actually been spending beyond their affordable means. And it also was another really important marker for us in looking for finding those people most likely to be gambling with misappropriated funds in the future and not waiting until they do. The trick is to have that model that's going to intervene before that happens. Now, for something like that, Sally, if you were right, only 1 out of every 3 people that you interacted with, and it's a very small number, is that a good enough accuracy? We'd say, yeah, actually, because you would never see this. This is not anything visible. This would be reasonable. However, if you're going to actually go up to someone, tap them on a shoulder while they're playing in a venue, you want to make sure that almost like 9 out of 10 times you're going up to them, it's the right person. Okay, because that's huge resources. It has implications or consequences for the individuals that you're talking to. You know, you still want it to be normalized. You want it to be, you know, saying hello to your customers and interacting with them. Because you also brought up another really important point is you can't simply go from 0 to self-exclusion. That's waiting until what is it, locking the barn door long after the horse is gone. The whole idea that we would all like to try to do is how can we move that upstream so that we actually stop that harm from occurring in the first place. This is some of the things that you will have heard. Simo even mentioned in his, then when him and Sarah were talking about the idea of lane assist and things like that. We know with products like financial products, or you know, cars, or many other products that are out there. There's a whole bunch of them. But let's just say your credit card, you know, they're being monitored all the time, and they're using that information not to wait until they think there has been a fraudulent activity occur, but ideally before, so that you are verifying that this is what it was that you wanted to do, that this was what you were supposed to do, you know, because maybe I got caught up in the moment and I was really excited at some, you know, shop, and I was saying, oh, I want all of this stuff. And then it's like, wait a second. Okay. Am I really, when I get up there, is this, you know, am I making these purchases? It also, we see when you're driving your car, you're talking to someone, you pulled out and it goes off, you were just slightly distracted, okay? And the idea is to prevent the accident from happening, not to keep you safe, like the seatbelt and the airbag when the accident happens, which are also important features. And that's where we've been. We've been there for so long of trying to put the airbags and the seatbelts on. And instead of making the product safer by avoiding the accident in the first place, which the insurance companies have found out is a lot more lucrative approach to be taking than doing a settlement after. So I think we are there. We've talked about responsible gambling as being the, it was basically about the individual playing responsibly and everything else, but safer gambling is about what the industry and the regulators are doing to make this a safer environment for the consumer to be in. And that includes having features that are going to keep everyone safe. Because one other thing we did find out is that although there is a small minority of people who do, end up having significant, problems with their gambling, there's a much larger number that can be just even transiently experiencing harm. And this can happen because, as you pointed out just a moment ago, you're playing, everything was great till you lost your job. And then this is a place where you were going to escape. Everything was good till somebody put you on Parkinson's medication. I was fine. My husband and I used to just go there until he passed away. And now I am looking at, this is a coping strategy for me. So people move in and out of things all the time that put them at risk that no operator or anyone else could ever know about. And so this constant contact and knowing your customers helps you to be able to see that. And some of these other, early systems that can see behaviors before we can, and the impacts are then become a tool to alert you when those things might be occurring and alert them to it as well. I mean, as an individual. So that didn't really answer your question though. So some of the models really accurate, okay? But no model is going to, the best model we have built using online data, and it was good, is we could find half of people over a course of a year interacting with 1% or less each month that were identified by these models. Now, I got to tell you something, in the world of modeling, that's spectacular. What other method do you know out there that could do that? Now, it's not the silver bullet that's going to do everything, but wow, it's going to really make sure that if you're going to have to do that part of it, it's going to be efficient for you.
Well, and that's really important because it means it's not the silver bullet. It doesn't alleviate venues and staff and, governments from other, making the product safer, staff interactions, staff, observations and conversations are still critical, but this is another layer, but it's not a set and forget. We've got that in now so we can go and start, doing something else. Look, Melissa, you've been at sort of the forefront of the research and evaluation. Can you tell me about some of the more recent findings you have? What are you excited about that you've more recently discovered, and what's to come? What are the areas that you really are excited to work on that you recommend others look into or watch this space for?
Definitely. So I think one of the most exciting things that we've been doing is, and we've kind of mentioned it a little bit already this session, is just around session length and risk. We have seen a lot in the literature that, the longer someone plays, the more likely they are to be experiencing risk. But what we're seeing when we actually look at the player data is that that might not be the full story. And I think some of it has to do with kind of sampling, with regular players or people who play a bit more frequently. We do see different play patterns emerge there than with casual players. And so much of the research that is out there, I think, is based on, prevalent studies and kind of maybe less representative of the gambling population. And so what we see is these more frequent players, they only make up 1/3 of all of the loyalty players, but they make up for almost 90% of all play activity that's carded. And so this is an area that we think is really important to focus on when we're sampling. And then among these regular players, we are seeing that there really is no differentiation between the distribution of I guess like risk within these sessions. So shorter sessions, medium sessions, longer sessions, they do tend to have a very similar distribution of risk between them. And that, high risk players, low risk players, they all tend to play an average amount, I guess an average session length that's quite similar, and they take similar length breaks. And so this, I think, was quite challenging, I think, for me, because seeing the literature, you kind of take it, and then seeing the player behavior, it's quite a different story. And so this is something that we're diving into a little bit more because it does have quite practical applications. It does, I think, present a slightly different story, and it does kind of show that maybe there are other, maybe more efficient ways of identifying risk within a session than just session length alone. And then some of the research that we've done kind of exploring, well, what is happening within these sessions? We see that long sessions tend to be more random than they are a product of risk. And so what I mean by that is that people who are playing long sessions tend to be either losing less or they tend to be winning more because they're either on a winning machine or they are, getting a little bit further along in their play with fewer resources. And so when, staff go out and interact with players after, let's say, 5 hours, and we've heard this from people kind of on the floor is that, well, when I'm losing, I never really hear from you, but boy, when I'm winning, you seem to come and talk to me a lot. And so we're seeing that kind of the regulations, the rules, and kind of what we've known to be true about risk and about play activity is changing quite a bit, or at least maybe is a little bit different than what we had originally thought. And that this does have like quite big implications for the player's experience as well.
And that's really important. A couple of things I want to quickly unpack. How do you define a regular gambler? Is that once a week, once a month?
So I think one of the definitions we've been working with is 6 or more times throughout a year. So once every 2 months, I suppose. But
Okay. So not a daily player. So you're looking at people who are still infrequent. And because that's what I was wondering then is frequency, and that totally makes sense, right? If it's particularly for a product like gaming machines, something like sports betting, I think would be totally different. But for gaming machines where it is continuous play, people are often looking for time on device as kind of their outcome of how much money can I kind of eke out, and people tend to roll over play because it's the nature of the product is that it goes back to the credit meter. So yeah, if you're having a long session, you're most likely having a winning session. I guess the question would be whether there's top ups. Have you seen something like, the number of times someone goes tops up, whether, gets new funds to continue a session? Is that a kind of a better risk marker then? Because that would indicate they're running out, but then deciding to regamble as opposed to continuing on with their initial funds. Is there something like top up, or then the potential other marker that comes to mind is frequency, because that's obviously initiating a new gambling session would indicate that they're a different type of category of player as well. So what about those two markers, frequency and kind of top up?
Yeah, I think actually, Sally, I think what you're really talking about is differences in how you are going to identify with different gaming populations. You're right. The sports betting is completely, and there's high seasonality in there that you have to control for. There are all, because it's primarily online, because there is, again, we know that we cannot use it, and they think, people are saying, well, if you can do it in the online environment, you can do it in the land-based environment. Completely different play patterns that we're seeing, okay? And we see completely different play patterns for sports bettors online than we do for online casino players.
Yeah, obviously.
Okay,
different
completely. Products. And so you're right. These are the specifics. You've got them again. That when we say frequency, the reason why we say frequency is you have to have enough sessions to be able to look at a pattern. Because the reason why in session risk detection is not effective is because of how much randomness there is in the game to make sure you can't influence what the outcome is. So in a single session, somebody can be a big winner, okay? Or somebody can be a little winner, or there's many different things that can happen, okay, in a single session of play that are outside of the control of the player themselves. We had that, conversation before, but there's really only 5 things that a player can control. And that is, what they're going to play, sports betting or, the casino games, when they're going to play it. I'm going to play now, or I'm going to play later tonight, how much they're going to wager, how fast they're going to spend it, and then when they're going to stop. Those are the 5 things they can control, nothing else. But everyone thinks they're controlling the length of their play, but they're not, because that is a function of the mediating factors of how much you're willing to wager and what the payouts are and what happens in that particular game. Or they think intensity is what is another, but that's an outcome of what happens again if you're winning versus losing, or if a bonus has come up, or if you're now got an in-betting option. In-game betting has changed everything in sports betting to make it more like, the casino games, right? Because you've added that other element in that has lower probability of, greater randomness in it. And it's a way to get them to be more engaged and continue to gamble during the session. So expenditure is a function of all those things that come out, as is the frequency that you're going to start to play. Okay. Because that's based on your resources. Because if you've got a win, you can play a little bit more often than if you didn't and you spent it all on that one go. So those variables that people often think are under the control of the person are actually mediated by things like money, accessibility, game type, payouts, what else? Use of tools, setting a budget, setting a time limit. Those things can all moderate and mediate those things. So those are things that you actually can, and I really liked what you said earlier, reward or reinforce for supporting better play, habits, that result in less risky outcomes for players. So in a single session, it's very difficult. We need to have a pattern of play, but that doesn't mean you can't intervene or you can't interact in real time. But this idea that is in everyone's mind that the second somebody's identified, you've got to get to them and do something right away, we just don't see it in practice. It's something that we know that multiple interactions produce better outcomes, even when they're kind of mediocre. That even just mediocre interactions where you're just saying hello, are you okay? If you're doing it often enough, we see that it has an impact. Okay, so the fact that they're showing some kind of caring or that the person isn't invisible is helpful. But when we see things like, we see even better outcomes when we look at their behavior post, comparing it to a baseline. And I know you've read the research, all the work that goes into that. And what we see is happening there, if you've got somebody who actually is a senior, social host responsibility, individual or ambassador, whatever they're called at their venue, and they've had a longer interaction with them, more in depth, that you're also more likely to have seen better outcomes 6 months, up to 6 months after you've had these interactions.
Maybe you could unpack that, and I'm mindful that we are unfortunately running close on time, as I knew would happen. But could you, if it's possible, briefly to share some of the markers of what you would consider a successful outcome? What are you looking for in terms of healthy play, and what are some of the markers that you would recommend people look for in terms of identification of risk, whether that be like a lower risk, sort of emerging risk, or a more definitive but less common risks? Do you have any kind of quick guidelines for what behaviors you're looking to see and what behaviors you are mindful, are kind of red flags or orange flags?
I'm going to have to give you the same answer, Sally. They change but there are some, like recovery. Recovery is something that, it's a great, powerful variable that we've used for many, many years. And what it does is it looks at the percentage of times people play and lose a significant amount of money, but win it back and stop playing. Okay. And this idea of recovery ends up being in most of our models simply because it is something that is so indicative of actual harm and risk, not of low risk. And people would think that it would be, oh, good, recovery, once they've done it, they check out and leave. And it's not. It's actually, there's people in having low rates of recovery means that you're not trying to win back your money. Okay,
It's
you're not
the reverse of chasing losses. It's chasing losses essentially.
And the other thing is chasing wins and understanding how important and when the win occurs. Now, that's another one that is really important in terms of because you see, because like we said, they're complicated variables. I know, but it doesn't matter. We can be complicated. So if, for example, if someone wins a large amount early in play, this could actually be problematic for somebody who has difficulties because they are here to also fill that time with play. And so, whereas someone who does not takes that money, cashes out, goes, okay, oh my God, I'm a winner, I'm taking this and I'm going. And I might play out my $20 that I originally put in or whatever it is. They'll take the winnings and go. The reinvestment of winnings is what makes that huge difference between why someone who's having difficulty really only gets back about 68 cents on the dollar versus somebody who is not having a problem is getting back about 77 cents.
I think that's really highlighted the importance of using objective data, but understanding the psychological ramifications of it. Because as you say, unsupervised machine learning is definitely in a big enough data set going to find a whole range of stuff. But it's about really taking it back to the, thinking about the psychology, thinking about the conceptual models that we know that people who are in control will leave a session. People who are out of control won't, so thinking about that, the chasing losses, the reinvestment of winnings, coming back, and the impact of those wins and losses on them from a psychological point of view. And that then is that layer of interpretation of it. And that's why it makes sense that, long sessions aren't necessarily a marker, but long sessions with repeated loss chasing or repeated reinvestment of winnings, that, so it's, I think that's a really,
now you're starting to put them together. Yes. And that's it.
And that clarification of that, the why, and this is something we were going to talk about with the next session, the why, thinking about not just the behavior, but what is the motivation. And that's why maybe it is talking to the individual and having to check in. They're like, no, I'm fine. I've been gambling for 5 hours because I'm, having a great time, versus, oh, I'm gambling for 5 hours because I lost my money and now I need to get it back. But look,
but how about
it all, but yeah.
But maybe, Sally, the message is listen, you may be winning. Okay, because if that's really what's likely to be happening, and that's also a good time for them to step away and do something else. So not saying it's not a bad time to deliver a message, but you better make sure it's the right message, because because this is even someone who may not be having an issue at all, but we know this, we see heightened play after big wins, and that later down the road is when that then becomes problematic. So maybe intervening at a point when sending a positive message whenever anyone has a big win is a good practice. We don't know. And these are the kinds of things that we'd like to see, and look at those kind of research. The only other thing I would caution about too is that, listen, if you were going to build your models and whatever you're going to use to identify, if it's going to be those people who self-exclude, that's who you're going to identify. If it's going to be people who are likely to go for treatment, that's who you're going to identify. You're not, and you are going to very specifically, that's how powerful these models are. So I really, you need to have a good, labeled data set. You've got to have great variables, and you have to test your model and evaluate.
And repeatedly iterate, refine,
always every time.
This is not a set and forget. And I think that's a really nice way to finish that. What I'm kind of hearing from this is the importance of using AI and data and the amazing things that be accomplished. However, only if you layer that with even stronger staff training, having people that can understand, interpret, have the conversations, then log those to kind of, integrate. And that's something we haven't really had time to work with, is how can you add feedback loops in? So, layer in sort of observation, keep adding information back into the model. And
Yes.
again, this idea of you need to have that test case. So you can't only rely on people who end up self-excluding. You almost need to repeatedly survey your customers so you can start to match and have the machine, learning be supervised and evolve over time. Like there's so much there. And I know you've got more to say, Tracy. I want to make sure, Melissa, before we end up, I want you to hand back to you to say, where are your, recommendations for if people are working in this space? What would you like, a second pair of hands on? What would you recommend other teams, whether they're industry, regulators or researchers, what would you like people to be working on to help you in your work?
I think really just bringing it back to the importance of evaluation and how we can really all work together in this space. I think, we've put forth, I think we've got about 10 kind of evaluation indicators that kind of map onto these harm indicators. But I think maybe coming up with some sort of standard set of these so we can compare impacts across jurisdictions, across operations, across players, and just making sure that, we're able to kind of see what is working and what's not working, and be able to kind of share these findings and really have a bigger impact, I guess, across the board.
That's awesome. And are those 10 indicators available somewhere that if people want to start being standardized, they can grab? Do you want to direct people to any resources that would be useful?
Yes, we have a report published on our website about the impact of customer interactions. And so this is some of the work that Tracy was speaking to earlier about how we've evaluated the safer gambling interactions with customers. And so in that report, we have a table with all of them. We've defined them. So I recommend everyone go check that out.
Amazing. And we'll add that to the show notes on the website. And Tracy, I know you've got a final comment to
Listen,
say.
it's a pleasure. It's just a pleasure though to get to talk about this, and I think in a kind of a casual way, not a standing up there. I wish there was more of that. Sally, thank you so much for
Yes.
giving us this forum to talk to you in and to whoever else is out there. And I hope that this is just going to open up the dialogue a lot more.
And if people
Yes.
want to get in touch with both of you, what's the best way?
The best way, I'm sorry, Sally, I didn't catch it.
To get in touch, is it LinkedIn, or the Focal Research has kind of a generic website contact, I think?
LinkedIn or email
Yeah,
or any.
email.
Yep,
Yeah,
and through
we
the
can put our
website.
emails in the chat as well.
Excellent. Well, look, it has been, I honestly could continue for another hour, so we might have to have you guys both back, because I feel like I have more questions now than when we
Good.
started.
Yeah.
We already knew this, and we have a lot of conversations. It's just been an absolute pleasure, and I have no doubt that everyone listening will have found this incredibly interesting. I do encourage people to read through those reports, and there are helpful executive summaries, but there's so much work out there. And Tracy, you've been, really a pioneer and pushing this work, and we have so much to learn from the amazing work that you're both doing. And I love your introduction of yourselves as researchers, which is just, it's such an important contribution you're both making and sharing the work that you do, which is so fantastic. Before I finish off, I'll do a last final plug. We're having an early career researcher showcase to finish season 5 of the webinar series. So if you know any early career researchers, we are really excited to feature them. Please get in touch with anyone who wants to share their research with us. But Tracy and Melissa, thank you so much for your generous time, for the evening for you, and in your knowledge of sharing with the audience.
Oh, thank you so much for having us, Sally.
And thanks everyone, and looking forward. Please tune in next week. Please share this with anyone who you think might be interested. And until next time, be well. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.